This presentation delves into a critical issue that has long-standing implications for our students, schools, and society at large: math placement. Edstar Analytics occupies a unique vantage point in this conversation. Our work involves not just data analysis, but also a deep understanding of the culture and the systemic factors that influence educational outcome. We collaborate with various stakeholders, ranging from program administrators to school counselors, to evaluate the effectiveness of educational programs. We also assist school improvement teams in making data-driven decisions. We've been doing this for 30 years. I'm going to share some eye-opening insights we've gathered over the years about math placement. These insights are not just numbers, they tell a story. And it's a story that challenges us to think how we approach math education and math placement. There's a lot of misleading information out there, so I aim to clarify some of that. Before we delve into the specific issue of math placement, it's important to set the context with some of our earlier findings. In our role as evaluators, we've often been tasked with assessing programs that are designed to bring students up to grade level, but what we have found would be startling to a lot of people. We kind of got used to it over the years. But frequently, these programs were serving students who were already at or above grade level. And why? Because they'd been recommended by teachers or school counselors who incorrectly believed that they were not proficient. We would interview the people who recommended the students to find out why were these students recommended for a program designed to bring them to grade level when they were already at or very often above grade level. And we found these recommendations would be influenced by students' socioeconomic status or the fact that they were enrolled in other programs that were typically aimed at low-achieving students. And they got into those programs the same way they got into these programs. But the pattern of misplaced recommendations serves as a backdrop to more specifically the issue of math placement, which we'll explore in detail in this presentation. Beginning around 2007, we started helping school counselors use data to identify very high-scoring students who were not enrolled in advanced courses. At first, they would tell us that we probably wouldn't find any. And after seeing the data, we started having school counselors guess how many there might be. We just wondered what their assumptions were. And we did this in many school districts where we worked with school counselors. And the school counselors were starting to want to use data to have more targeted services. And they always thought that there would be either none or very few, because they thought if there were high-achieving minority students, they would already be enrolled in advanced courses. And we found so many they could hardly believe it. The school counselors became aware of this concerning trend. The high-scoring students who were not enrolled in advanced courses were at a higher risk of dropping out, which we also saw from looking at their data. And this led to the initial steps of trying to address this issue. For one of the large school districts that we were working with their school counselors, after becoming aware of this issue, we looked at 7 different middle schools to see what percentage of the students who scored at the top level, not just proficient, but at the highest level of proficiency, the above grade level. And at that time, it was level 4 in North Carolina. We now have level 5, but this was level 4 because they were curious as to the fact that there were students who scored at the highest level and they were not in 8th grade algebra. So that's what we were looking at. And what you see here, the 7 different schools, the percent of the level 4 students who were in 8th grade algebra varied tremendously by school. There was one school where almost nobody was, there were plenty of kids who scored at the highest level, but they weren't in 8th grade algebra. And then at the school 6 there, almost everybody who scored at the highest level was in 8th grade algebra. And there at school 3, a little bit more than a third of them were in 8th grade algebra. That's of the kids who scored at the highest level. The school counselor had no idea that there were so many high-scoring students who were not in advanced courses. A lot of their efforts and the efforts of different programs that were grant-funded to raise achievement or to raise close achievement gaps had been targeting students who were scoring below grade level with the goal of getting them to the point where they could take advanced courses. What they hadn't realized was they already have kids who are prepared to take advanced courses, and they're not in them. And then we looked at that data by race and income, and what we found was that there were major racial disparities in advanced math placement when comparing students who scored at the top level. People knew that there were major racial disparities in students who were enrolled in advanced math, but what they didn't know was how many top scoring minority students there were who were not enrolled in advanced math. And this was curious. It surprised us all. And we started looking at the national literature, and we found that this was well documented in the national literature. In fact, one research study that we found said that the main predictors of sixth grade math placement are social factors, with race being one of the most significant factors. And we had not realized that this was a well-documented national phenomenon that was in the literature. And we also found that sixth grade placement was the best predictor of whether or not you took eighth grade algebra. So school counselors then focused on trying to enroll these high-scoring students into advanced math courses. But the resistance they faced was significant. And the teachers insisted that such enrollment was based solely on teacher recommendations, because that was traditionally how it always had been done. So a task force was created to delve deeper into this issue. It was comprised of school counselors, data experts, math teachers, and administrators. There were university people on the task force, and Edstar Analytics was also on the task force. And the task force aimed to answer one main question: why can't all schools enroll top-scoring math students into the advanced math track? So working with the task force, what we found was that the placement for sixth grade was made by the fifth grade teachers. So the task force had Edstar Analytics survey the fifth grade teachers to discover how were they making the placement decisions for middle school sixth grade math. And what we discovered was both enlightening and concerning. These teachers were making crucial placement decisions before they had the standardized math scores. So instead, they relied on their estimates of what they believed the scores would be. And on the forms that they used to recommend the students, they would write the standardized test scores as if they were already existing, but they were actually predictions. So we were able to take those and compare their predictions, which they based their placement on, to the actual scores after they came out. And our analysis of this data revealed a trend where minority students were often underestimated in what they were going to score, and the white students were frequently overestimated. And there was a statistically significant difference in these estimations. And additionally, some teachers base their recommendations on personal beliefs because they weren't instructed that they had to use data. And a lot of them told us that they believed it was better to delay advanced math courses because you'd get a better foundation. So they hesitated to place anybody high. Some expressed, in fact, a lot of them expressed a desire for more guidance on how to make these important decisions because they said they didn't really know. And we had some of them told us they hesitated to place girls in advanced math classes because then as they got older, they would be in classes with older boys and they didn't think that would be good for them. And it was just all across the board. But this survey highlighted the urgent need for objective, data-driven criteria for math placement. It was clear that the methods that were being used, there was no standardized approach. And we could see in the data that there was bias when there was no objective criteria. From about 2007 to 2015 or so, we worked with individual schools to help them use data and help them look at their math placement compared to math achievement. And no school system that we worked with had any policies, objective criteria, or even guidance for teachers to tell them how to place students. Individual teachers used whatever criteria seemed right to them. And then when presented with the data, the decision to either use the data-driven criteria or traditional teacher recommendations was ultimately up to individual principals. And we have some examples where data-driven approaches led to successful outcomes because many principals decided they were going to use the data and ignore the teacher recommendations. And in these cases, a vast majority of the students placed in advanced courses thrived. Their parents were supportive. A lot of these students were low-income students, and their parents were overjoyed that they were being put in the advanced track. And then SAS did a follow-up study because there was a worry that the students might do well at first and then later they wouldn't do well. And what they found was that 90% of them were still in the advanced track being successful 2 years later. Here's an example of principal impact. Edstar Analytics was working with the school improvement team in a magnet school in a large school district, and we were working with the school counselors in that district also, and we had already seen that minority students were rarely placed in advanced math, even when they scored at the highest level on standardized tests and earned A's in all their courses. So we already were aware of that, and we were hired by the school system to work with the school improvement teams that had the largest achievement gaps. So we were working with one of the middle schools, and we helped them look at their data, their math placement data. And we looked at the sixth graders, and because this was a magnet school, the sixth graders came from schools all over the district, many different elementary schools. And when we looked at the math recommendations compared to the achievements, we found that only 15% of the Black and Hispanic and Latino students who scored at the highest possible level of proficiency in fifth grade were recommended to be in the top track. The principal was a member of the school improvement team, and he decided to place all of the incoming sixth graders who scored at the highest level in the advanced sixth grade track, regardless of what was recommended by the fifth grade teacher. And after a year of being in the top track, the achievement gap for the school closed. This was about a little bit over 100 students. Half of these students got A's in their sixth grade math class. Another third of them got B's, and only 2 of them failed. This is of 103 kids. But then the principal changed in that school. But since it was up to the principal, when the new principal came in, we were still working with the school and their school improvement team. And we met with the school improvement team, the math teachers, and the new principal. Dr. Lee Stiff and I from Edstar Analytics met with them. And the math teachers explained to us that the parents of the upper class students were complaining and putting pressure on them because they saw too many minority students in the advanced math class, so they assumed it must not be advanced, or that the standards were being lowered if these students were in there, and they wanted their students in a different class. The school improvement team wanted to keep these students in the advanced track and place them all in 8th grade algebra. But the math teachers and the new principal explained that not only were the parents complaining, but that they had been placing these academically successful minority students into the courses where the students with IEPs were to be mainstreamed. And that because these students needed so little instruction to be able to do their work, this allowed the teachers to give the students with IEPs the attention that they needed. And as surprising as that was, we started hearing that from other schools also. So what happened? They placed these students in 8th grade math instead of 8th grade algebra because they said they just weren't able to put them in 8th grade algebra for these reasons. There's some misinformation about one of the schools that we worked in, so I want to clarify that. We worked with a middle school, and the principal looked at the EVOS data, and SAS had recommended a 70% cut. But when she looked at how many students made 70% the threshold, it was over 100 students. And she already had 25 students who had been recommended by teachers to take 8th grade algebra. And she just couldn't bring herself to put another 100. They'd never had more than one 8th grade algebra class. So we recommended that she use 80 as the cut, which is what she did. So any students with made the 80% threshold, she put them into 8th grade algebra. So then this was 50 students. So then they had 75 students in 8th grade algebra. And all of these students were successful in algebra, and they were among the highest scoring students in the class. In fact, the highest scoring was one of the students in this group that was admitted due to their EVA score, not by teacher recommendation. Now, some people have argued that everything's fine, so why would we change anything with math placement? And in some of those arguments, there are things that are confusing or not really relevant. There's been some research published about the school that we worked with where the principal used the 80% threshold for making the cut to put students in 8th grade algebra, but they assumed that this principal had used a 70% threshold because later this district passed a policy about using 70%, but that's not what the principal used. So making that wrong assumption, they then looked at the cohort from that school that had a 70% EVA score that year in algebra, but half of those students didn't take 8th grade algebra. At least half of them didn't. And the students who had been recommended by teachers, we didn't know what their EVA scores were. So there were 75 students taking 8th grade algebra. We knew that 50 of them scored above 80, and we don't know what the other 25 scored because we didn't look, because they were recommended by teachers and they were going to stay in there anyway. But this research that was published and presented and is sometimes pointed to it on this school to see whether or not this was successful, they followed the cohort of students that made the 70% cut. The researchers then concluded that the success that is often pointed to with this school was actually short-term success, because when they looked at the students who scored above 70 or met the 70 threshold on their EVA score, that by the end of high school, a good proportion of them were no longer taking advanced courses. But that research is actually following a lot of students who never took 8th grade algebra in the first place. So don't be swayed by that research that the success is only short term because they looked at the wrong kids. Another point that needs to be clarified is that the origins of advocating for objective math placement criteria were because of the students up here with the very high scores who didn't have any way to get access because they weren't recommended by teachers. And if teacher recommendation was the only way in, they didn't have any way in. And the school counselors weren't able to get a lot of those kids enrolled. And parents came to Edstar Analytics and had us advocate with them to convince the school to let them in. And in some cases they did, and in other cases they didn't. And some of the research that's been done that looks to see, using fancy statistics, something called regression discontinuity analyses, to see is 70 a good place for the line. Although they don't say it, they lay the groundwork for the reader to infer that the line is being moved down to 70 so that low-income and minority students will be included. And there was no line. The line's not being moved down. There was no line. And the low-income and minority students who scored in the 90s were not being included. In one school that we looked at in one of our poorer school districts in North Carolina, but medium-size district, we looked in one middle school, and there were 97 sixth graders who were low-income and minority students with scores in the 90s, EVAS predictions in the 90s, and they were in the standard math track. And the school moved, I think, 25 of them, 25 of the highest scoring ones into the advanced track, but this was out of 97 of them. So the issue is not, should we move the bar down in order to include more low-income and minority students? The issue is, should we have a bar at all? So if the high-scoring low-income and minority students can have access, even if they don't have advocates. We've heard a lot of reasons for why some educators think that we should not have objective criteria. These are some of the reasons that we commonly hear, and in red I've put some of the issues that you should think about when you hear these reasons. And I should point out that the districts that we have worked with and the schools we've worked with, it didn't cost them any additional money to have these students moved to the advanced track. It was all middle schools we were working with, but there was no money involved, no additional training. If your middle school math teachers have math education degrees, they should be able to teach an advanced middle school course. And we've also found inability to work with data has been a big stickler. Like, didn't know how to use EVOS, didn't know how to get a list of the students who had scored at a certain point. And we've had many educators tell us that they think they have to pull the paper out of the filing cabinet and go through it all to identify the students. It would be easy to address most of these issues. It would also be easy to have accountability to see what's actually being done.